Welcome, this is Irene Woods. In this video we will set up the GK370 flatbed knitting machine. It is a small mid-gauge machine with 100 needles. It will knit most hand knitting yarns labeled 2, 3, or 4 on the ball band, or sock weight, DK, and knitting worsted weight yarns. For beginners, number 3 or DK weight yarns are recommended. This machine is made in China according to the label on the bed, but it was apparently intended to be sold in Japan. I purchased this one on Amazon. It was sold and shipped from a seller in Japan. The marking on the box are all Japanese, except for a small amount of Western script on the left top side. The Western script won't help you much though, since it is still Japanese words, but written with Western letters. Now let's see what's inside the box. The first thing we see is a plastic bag with the documents. The white booklet is the owner's manual. It has very nice illustrations, which you should find helpful, even though all the instructions are in Japanese. Next is a colorful pamphlet that appears to show what the machine can do, but again, I couldn't read it. And then there is a single page of photos showing the few stitches and how to work them. I will be doing some videos in another few days, and we will start covering what this machine actually can do, including several stitch designs. Some of them will be the ones on this insert, but we can also do a lot more than that. So I hope you'll keep following along as we explore this little machine together. Now let's take everything out of the box. The styrofoam trays are packed very tightly inside. I found it easier to remove the left side first. There is a small cutout on the left. Place your left hand under the tray there and at the same time lift up on the right side. You might need to wiggle this a bit as you lift up. Push the right tray toward the left. Put your right hand into the cutout on the end and lift it out. I put both trays on the table behind the box for now. Take out the bed. It seems like the easiest way would be to lift it up using the carriage handle. Do not do this. It could damage the carriage. Instead, place your hands under the bed and lift it up. This is a very lightweight machine. It can even be picked up with one hand, but it is safer to use both. Place the machine on the table. The machine comes with a bag of tools. There are 2 needle selectors. I will show you how they are used later. One of them has a flat side, and every other needle selector prongs on the second side. The other selector has a 3x1 setting on one side and a 1x3 setting on the other. There is a tool with a small latch hook on one end and a large one on the other. Next we have a transfer tool with 1 prong on one end and 2 prongs on the other end. This tool is used to move stitches when increasing or decreasing. There is also a yarn needle. A DVD is included, but I had a very hard time finding an app that would play it. I think it must be encoded for the Asian market. One of my Lenovo laptops has a Lenovo-specific DVD player, and that finally worked. All I can suggest is keep trying, and you might find one that would work on your computer. In the left tray there are 2 claw weights. These will get you started. They are available from any knitting machine dealer, but if you don't have one near you, Amazon and eBay have several listings and they are not very expensive. 2 clamps are included. They are used to fasten the machine to the table. A row counter is next. It's adjusted by twisting the knobs on top, and it records rows from 000 to 999. Numbers advanced one at a time when the tripper or the flipper is pushed sideways from either right to left. The tension spring is part of the feeding system. There's an extension bit on the bottom that fits into the opening on the left rear of the carriage. We will connect them a little later in this class. And last, there are two cast-on combs. They can be joined together with the connector piece as shown. A small piece of knitting needs only one, but when knitting with more than 50 needles, use both. The comb is weighted and it helps keep an even tension on the knitted fabric by pulling it down as you knit. These are easy to put together and take apart. We're going to attach the tension spring. Line up the extension on the base with the notch on the carriage and insert it by pushing down firmly into the carriage. Make sure that the carriage is seated correctly on the bed before we go on. Push the carriage back and forth a few times. It should move freely with little to no resistance. We're now going to practice removing and replacing the carriage on the bed. There is a lever on the back of the carriage. Pull it towards you while lifting the back of the carriage up and towards you. Watch what happens as you pull the lever. There is a piece on the rear of the carriage that moves. This piece has a groove that fits over the raised piece on the bed called the rail. It's just behind the needles at the rear of the needle bed. Pulling the lever releases this grooved piece on the carriage from the bed and allows it to come free without damage. To put the carriage back on the machine, pull the lever forward. While holding the lever, put the front of the carriage under the front edge of the bed. Then lower the carriage down until it is flat on the bed. The carriage should now be fastened in place. Carefully slide the carriage back and forth. It should move freely. There are little raised pieces on the front of the bed ends. These are stoppers that keep the carriage from sliding off the bed. If you have trouble putting the carriage back on, there is another method. Take the carriage off the bed, line it up so that the grooved piece on the back of the carriage matches up with the rail on the bed. The carriage needs to be level, not tilted either backwards or forwards. Slide it on, making sure that the front of the carriage also seats correctly in place. This can be done from either side of the bed. Let's look at the needle bed next. Turn it over. There is an extension piece on each end, and I usually leave these out except when putting the machine back in the box because they give a little more support for the carriage. Push down on the white tab with one hand and pull the extension out with the other. There are two metal plates on the bottom. They hold the three sections of the bed together. You should see what looks like a tiny crack in the bed just above each one. This is not damage. The bed is made of plastic and that's where the sections join together. The plates are screwed into them and they act as braces to keep them together. The plates have another job as well. The indentations above them are where the clamps go. Place the bed flat on the table. I'm using my sewing machine table. That's why you see that dark rectangle on it. That section drops down so the sewing machine is level with the tabletop. You can use nearly any table or desk that has a lip or an edge that extends about 2 inches, enough for the clamps to fit. It should be a straight edge. Don't try to put this on a table that has a curved or oval shape because there's not enough table lip on that shape for the clamps to hold on to. And if the clamps do not go on securely and tightly onto your table, you run the risk of the machine falling off frontwards onto the floor. This close-up shows the clamp assembly. Have the machine with the edge of the bed in front, even with the edge of your tabletop. Insert the clamp into the opening and tighten it down. Do this on both sides of the bed. Attach the row counter. Put the row counter on the rear of the needle bed. There is a slot just a little left of center. Hold the row counter with the numbers facing you and push it firmly into place. The bottom extension must go all the way down into the slot. Place the carriage back on the bed. There is a little extension lever on the rear of the carriage. It hits the flipper on the row counter every time the carriage passes across, and it moves the row count ahead by one number. It does this both when the carriage passes to the right and again when it passes to the left. Every time the carriage crosses in front of the row counter, the numbers will advance. We're now going to cast on, and to do that we're going to use one of the cast-on combs. Turn it so that the white plastic end pieces face you. There is a yarn clip on each end that will hold the yarn tail. I am using Simply DK yarn from Paintbox. This is one of the thicker DK yarns, and it really is knitting more like a light knitting worsted. It knits well in this machine and produces a warm garment or hat. The yarn feeds into the front of the carriage, and it works best when it's kept on the floor in front of you. I like to keep mine in something, so I'm just using a box this time. I have wound one of the red balls into a cake with my yarn winder. This isn't absolutely necessary, but the yarn must feed freely at all times. Even with a cake, I pull out several yards into a loose pile so that there is no tension on the yarn coming from the ball or the cake. This is even more important when knitting directly from a factory wound ball, since there can be tangles, often called yarn spaghetti or yarn barf, in the center. Take the every other needle selector out of the package. With the flat side, pull forward as many needles as fit the width of the selector. Turn the selector over and push every other stitch all the way back. This takes them out of work and they will not knit. If you have not already done it, raise the handle on your knitting machine. You will need it from here on. We're now going to thread the carriage. Hold the tail in your right hand, and with your left hand hold the yarn coming from the ball. Slide the yarn into the spring eyelet at the bottom of the carriage, then under the plastic feeder at the top edge of the carriage, through the eyelet in the tension spring, and then down into the main slot on the carriage, paying special attention to the main slot in the carriage. Take the carriage across to the left while continuing to hold the yarn tail. Here is a close-up of the threading path. Turn the stitch dial to 7. Hang the cast-on comb centered as closely as possible so that one tooth of the comb goes over the yarn bar between the needles. Take the yarn tail and wind it up under and over the little hook on the white plastic at the end of the cast-on comb. Bring the alternate needles and all of the needles that have yarn on them all the way forward. This should be every needle you originally pulled forward with the flat side of the needle selector. Knit one row. Check to be sure every needle knitted and that there are no dropped stitches. Return the row counter to 002 because we have just knitted 2 rows. Continue to knit until the row counter reads 030. Cut the yarn a few inches away from the end stitch and take the carriage across empty. The fabric will fall off. Be aware that the same thing will happen when you are knitting if the yarn accidentally comes out of the carriage. You might be very surprised to find the knitting in your lap or on your feet. After you knit the last row, and before you take the carriage across empty, it's a good idea to remove the cast-on comb and all weights that are on your fabric. If you don't do that, and you take the carriage across empty, it's very possible that everything will drop on your feet. That hurts. So always remove anything dangling, any weights, the cast-on comb, and later on when you begin to knit garments, we use a lot of clothespins or clips to keep the yarn ends down. Whatever is on the machine is going to come off, and if it is something heavy and it hits your feet, it will hurt. So after you get the fabric off the bed, give it a good tug all directions. The yarn is stretched out and the fabric is stretched out when it's on the machine. And giving it a good sharp tug in each direction relaxes the yarn and relaxes the fabric and lets everything go back into its correct shape. We're going to touch briefly on the subject of blocking. The following method of measuring gauge is the way hand knitters do it. It is not the way most machine knitters measure it, and I will have a tutorial for that method in the future. For now, this works quite well for DK and worsted weight yarns, and for simple items such as hats that don't require a precise fit. We did not bind off the swatch, so do this carefully. Pin the swatch down on blocking material. I'm using a blocking board, but any blocking material will work. Pin it down carefully without stretching. I'm using a Susan Bates Knit Chek. My old one is at the top of the picture, and it's been through the wars. It's all beat up. The one that I'm actually using for counting gauge is the newer model, and it has more of the circular openings for measuring bigger needles. Basically what you do is count the stitches horizontally and the rows vertically. In this case, I was getting 14 rows per 2 inches in the vertical measurement and 10 stitches per 2 inches in the horizontal measurement, and is actually a lightweight knitting worsted. This concludes the lesson on setting up the GK370 knitting machine. I hope you found it useful. In the following tutorials, we will begin using the machine to knit garments, and I will be covering techniques, and some of them will not even be ones that are found in the knitting manuals, but things that we've learned over the years of using home knitting machines. Thanks for visiting.